Particularly with technology and social media, it can be really easy for boundaries to not be a thing for young people because they're accessible to each other all the time. They've got that online access constantly.
The first area is material boundaries. Now, this essentially refers to any material thing in our world. So it could be a device.
Mental boundaries are then boundaries that we put on our own beliefs and our values and holding them very firm. And they are often challenged when someone is trying to give you their belief or their thought and you don't know or you aren't confident enough in yourself to be able to hold that and be like, this is what I believe. I know that you'll believe that. That's okay, but this is mine.
PodClass acknowledges the true and traditional custodians of the land we meet on here today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respect to elders past and present and are grateful to be on this country.
So no one told you teaching was gonna be this way. Your lesson plans are jokes, your patience broke, you're feeling in disarray. It's like you're always stuck in report writing, when it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, or even your school year. But I'll be here for you.
When the students start to riot,
I'll be here for you.
even if your coffee is gone cold,
I'll be here for you, 'cause you're there for them too.
Hello and welcome to PodClass 2025. We are so excited to be back. My name is Will Massara and I'm the CEO of Youth Leadership Academy Australia.
And you, Will, are joined by your co-host,
I
which
am
is
indeed.
us.
Hello, we're the
2025 is the year of independence, okay? Take it away yourselves.
Do it yourself. All right, we will.
Yeehaw.
My name is Sky Hughes and I'm one of the co-founders of Youth Engagement Project.
And my name is Amanda Marshall. I'm the other co-founder of Youth Engagement Project. And we're thrilled to be back on your eyes and in your ears. However, that doesn't really make sense.
We are indeed. I think it would be fun to just share some monumental moments Sky and I have had and Amanda has had over the holidays.
Monumental.
But mainly Amanda and I.
Yeah, mainly
Some
us.
achievements.
Mainly-
I mean,
Yeah.
not much happened for you, Sky.
I think a lot has happened for the two of you in
Yeah.
this break, so it would be rude not to share it.
Well, I planted a veggie garden, which was huge. I've been wanting to plant one for like 6 months. I've been in my house for 12 months and it was really beautiful. What about you, Will?
I almost started dating.
Oh,
Yeah. I was like, you know what?
Almost.
2025 is the year that I almost start
Okay,
dating.
can we
And I went on a
download
total
one
of
app?
0 dates in my break.
Can we share what actually happened? So Will Will works a lot running Weiler and Will actually had a fortnight off for the first time in how many years?
Dad was like, I was like, Dad, this is the longest time I've had off. He was like, no, when you were a kid. I was like, what? Before I was 11?
Anyway, so you haven't had a fortnight off for a long time and Will didn't know what he was going to do. And before he went on break, he was like, oh, so much time off. I might have to start a hobby. I might start dating.
And we were like, is that a hobby these days? But we love that.
Welcome to Gen Z.
So you nearly started dating and Sky Hughes, maybe a few small things in your
Yeah,
world?
really small announcements in my world. First being that I'm having a baby.
A child.
Woo!
Gen Beta.
Yeah, it's going to be Gen Beta, which is so weird. I was working out the other day. It's going to be like 2040 something.
You're going to be a boomer
when
to
they
them.
like graduate high school and like do all these things. It's just
I
like the
can't.
most bizarre thing to talk about.
I cannot, honestly.
So that's crazy.
That
we
must be
are-
old, right?
Yeah, it feels that way. We're about halfway cooked. So
How big are we talking?
we are like, I think like the length of a corn cob or something
so
this week.
fun.
It's like 30 centimeters.
I just
Anyway.
love the changing fruit and vegetable every week. It's very exciting.
It's great. And the other very small news in my world is that I got engaged.
Yay! If you remember back maybe 10 episodes, Sky did call out Jay for not having a ring on the finger.
It was
And now we've got one. We've got
and
that
it's
ring.
beautiful.
It is.
He had it specially designed, just gorgeous. So yes, just a few small announcements from Sky Hughes and some huge
2025
developments.
is our year, Amanda.
Will's dating and Amanda's planting veggies. So we are in for a treat. 2025, let's go.
And we hope your holidays were just as exciting as ours as we re-enter the PodClass era.
Yes, and we are making our way into the year with a familiar topic. We all know this word. It is the one about boundaries.
We know boundaries are just so important. Whether you are a teacher, facilitator, someone who just works with young people or works with anyone in general, having boundaries is such an important part of looking after ourselves and our well-being and getting it right. Like, it's such a great time to reflect on our boundaries at the start of a year, because if we're maybe thinking back to 2024 and previously and some areas that maybe we didn't have such great boundaries, this is a chance to kind of stop, pause, reflect and put some new boundaries in place.
Right. And so it's huge on a personal note, and I think also on a professional note, whether we are setting up a classroom for the year or we are, getting ready within a youth organisation or whatever it is, it's a really powerful time to get clear on what boundaries we'll be implementing, both personally and professionally and for young people we work with, and also putting in the time and effort and consistency to implement those boundaries.
And probably acknowledging as well, every year we probably say, I'm going to do this less, I'm going to do this less. And often it doesn't actually happen because we set these huge, unrealistic boundaries that aren't often achievable. So it's like, well, this conversation is about what small shifts that we can make within our boundaries that actually are achievable. It is for 2025. Boundaries that are achievable.
Amazing. And so we're going to go through like why boundary setting, and we're also going to cover just briefly why boundaries tend to falter in different areas, whether it be as a teacher in a classroom or a parent or, putting them in place for ourselves. And we're going to go into, I guess, what the implications are of when we let those boundaries down and how that can leave us feeling, and also the 4 types of boundaries, because there are 4 types of boundaries. And having them is a really powerful beginning, and then holding them is honestly just like a gift to ourselves and to the young people we work with.
So I guess it's important before we go any further to actually say, like, what are boundaries? What are they? Because we think about boundaries in a physical sense as like a fence that we put up or some kind of physical barrier that we put up.
The property ends here.
Yeah. It's kind of the same thing.
Forever.
Yeah, they have. And our personal boundaries are no different. When we talk about boundaries in this sense, what we're talking about are those mental, physical, emotional limits that we can kind of have in place that we set for ourselves in different areas of our lives. And they can change depending on the context, depending on who we're working with and what the situation is. Like, I would have different boundaries in my personal life and in my home life, like with my partner, than I would with work colleagues. So it's really important to understand that our boundaries do shift and change based on our context.
Yeah. And I think the purpose of them is to create environments of safety, of respect, and also create environments where we can grow. Because we're going to get into like, how does it feel if a boundary's been overstepped? And it's actually really disruptive to our well-being when boundaries get overstepped or when we fail to implement and hold them. And we can't grow in those environments. We can't grow effectively. We can't effectively create, really open and honest relationships either. So
think about it like a country. If someone tries to steal your land, you
where
feel
is this going?
disrespected. You feel disrespected. You feel like you don't trust them anymore. But when the boundaries are firm, they're respected by both sides as well. Happy days.
Love. I'm just wondering, before we dive any further, what is a boundary that all of us put in place over the break and actually held?
Like Amanda said, it was the very first time in a very long time that I haven't touched the laptop in a substantial 16 days, so much so that there was dust on it by the time I returned to work.
It's serious when there's dust on your laptop.
Not that I cleaned, but there was a lot of dust. So that was mine. I was pretty happy about it.
That's good.
That is good.
Mine was I actually put an out of office on my inbox for the first time. I've never done that before in my history of work. And I was like, no, I'm going to put an out of office on and I'll be like returning to work on this date, and just did not check work emails for that entire period. And it was kind of bliss. It was awesome.
Mine is that I am just like a yes woman. I just say yes all of the time. And I actually said no to a number of social things, whether it be family or friends, because I needed to be like a little introvert bug on the break and just fully recharge. And it worked and it felt great. It felt uncomfortable saying no, but then it felt great,
Yeah, the cortisol after and opening that laptop for 16 days was like, well, it could be in here.
Love this for you. And I also think too, like before, we obviously work with young people. And when we think about boundaries and young people, it's really important for us to understand what they are, but also how to model those, because particularly with technology and social media, it can be really easy for boundaries to like not be a thing for young people because they're accessible to each other all the time. They've got that online access constantly. So when we're teaching or when we're parenting or when we're working with youth, being able to model and articulate and express our boundaries is such a great way to model and, on that subconscious level, encourage our young people to be setting boundaries themselves.
And I think what's really interesting is just anecdotally across, all of the work we do with young people and youth organisations and schools, especially in the back end of last year, there was so much chatter around behavioural challenges with young people. And studies show that there can be a reduction of up to 40% of behavioural challenges when boundaries are known, they're clear and they're held.
Yeah.
And, there's someone who we've worked with a long time and they always say boundaries are love.
Yeah.
Like boundaries are love. And the role of a young person is not to be like, oh, that's a boundary. Okay, I will fully respect that at all times.
No, it's to push up right against it.
Yes, and
it's
test
our responsibility to hold it there.
Like, is this a rotting, flimsy fence I can plow through, or is this a firm, strong fence that can hold me where I'm meant to be held?
And feel safe in that environment as a result of being held. And I think it's really easy towards the end of the year to let boundaries lapse a little bit, being really clear around start and finish times for classes or letting students go from class early and all these like tiny little boundary shifts. But those small shifts can make a big difference over time because it compounds. And what it says is it sends a message to a young person, that's all right, keep pushing. If you push hard enough, the boundary will move. Yeah. Yep. And that's not at all the example that we want to be setting up or the environment that we want to be setting up for our students.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's often times that we have this fear of boundaries, right? Because we don't want to seem like the bad guy or the bad person.
And I think that's a big thing. And let's talk about that briefly. Why do we falter from these boundaries, whether it be personally or whether it be as a parent or a teacher or whatever it is? Obviously, exhaustion and just being worn down. It's like, oh my gosh, yes, have the lolly. Yes, have the free time. Grab the iPad, whatever it is.
Loving this as I'm coming into my parenting era. Thanks. Thanks everyone for the reminders.
Yeah. So it's obviously exhaustion and being tired is one of the factors. It's been a long day or a challenging day or whatever it is. But I think there's a lot of other factors that play into it as well. And it is so much of what you just said, Will. We don't want to be the bad guy. But the role of a parent and a teacher and a facilitator and an adult role model in a young person's life is not exclusively a friendship role. It is the person to set those limits because they're the limits that we learn from at the end of the day.
But even between colleagues, right? There's that fear of conflict that exists there. Will, you started talking about it, but why does that fear exist? Or why are we scared of having those boundaries in place with colleagues and in the workplace?
I think it's a level of unknown of you don't know how they're going to react. It's I know for me, something I often struggle with is I fear putting a boundary because who am I to say that? Yeah. It's why do I believe that and why is what I believe right?
And then it's what other people would think of you as a result of that. Yeah. So it's Will's well, my boundary is that I don't respond to, messages for work messages after 5 o'clock. And other people maybe do that because they don't have that boundary in place. Definitely. So then if you're not doing that, they're oh, Will, he just doesn't work as hard as all of us.
And then there's a perception of being a control freak, right? Because you have your boundaries and you're firm to them, but it's are you? They're just standards as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, which kind of is another reason why that we might avoid them is that the emotional load of having to hold those boundaries all the time can sometimes feel like a lot energetically. But I also think, and Amanda, I know this is something that you and I have spoken about a lot, is the flip side of that is once we get our boundaries right, we actually gain so much more back because energetically that emotional output, once it's clear to other people what our boundaries are, we are gaining energy back because we are no longer having to spend that time reinforcing them because it's clear. People know what they are and they don't move. And when that has been solidified enough times and it's been other people have been reminded enough that that's the case, they're not going to push against them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can feel almost like a loss of freedom and a little uncomfortable when we're setting them and holding them. And the loss of freedom thing is what it can feel like to a young person or to a colleague or to a friend or whatever that is. Like I can't just get a response from Will after 5 p.m. You know, I mean, wouldn't that be great if that was your actual boundary? Could you imagine? But yeah, I just, I think as well it's like, okay, so this is why sometimes they're not held in place and we all understand that. It can also be a confidence thing, like how do I set them and what does that look like? If this is something I'm wanting to bring into my life for the first time or into my profession or into my classroom in a new and different way, you know, it does take confidence, it does take learning and understanding, and hopefully this episode, you know, we're about to go through the 4 types of boundaries and hopefully through unpacking them we can get clear on, so it's not just like boundaries is a blanket statement. Like there are different realms, there are different aspects to boundary setting. And it can be uncomfortable when we've got to hold them. But when we hold them in place, we get that freedom back.
But I think the flip side of not holding them is like so much worse, right? In the long run. It's like what happens when we don't hold them in place? We're going to have higher levels of stress. We're going to be responsible for more things. We're going to have to deal with more people and we're not going to be able to know exactly what we want or how we want it either. We're not going to receive what we need.
And I think it can sometimes happen when there's no thought put into what your boundaries are. And I'm thinking from a classroom perspective in particular. I remember as a first-year teacher, I didn't really understand boundaries and what that meant in my classroom space. And I would say maybe one thing to one student, and then it would be not a different rule, but just because I hadn't thought about it, maybe give a different response or an answer to another student. And then you would get this conflict that would arise. And then, right. And they'd be like, oh, well, how come so-and-so gets to do that, but I don't get to do that? Or how come you sat with so-and-so for 10 minutes, but you told me that I had to come in at lunchtime or whatever it might be. And it made me really reflect as an educator. And I was like, oh, whoa, I need to get my boundaries right. So that's really clear and really consistent to students because that's going to create safety, but it's also going to boost my classroom culture because every single young person knows where they stand. They know how to interact with me as the educator, and that's what's important for them.
And I think especially in a classroom context, it's okay. Is it going to take time and energy and effort at the beginning of the year? Like, yes, undoubtedly. But that is time, effort, and energy invested.
Yeah.
Because that is rewards, dividends, safety, respect, growth we can reap throughout the year.
Yeah.
That's not to say young people aren't going to push up against them. Like, have they had a bad night's sleep? Are they having an average day?
Yeah.
Did something go down at lunchtime? We're going to get that push. And of course, like once they're set, like can we soften? Can we meld at times in special circumstances? Like the answer is yes, and we're going to. But yeah, if we can put in that
us to sit here and be like, no, they stay there every single day.
Precisely.
We are not trees, we move.
We are. And it's important to note we have to provide students with the rationale or the why behind boundaries in place.
Yeah, I would be so frustrated if you didn't as well.
And like it's where parenting and stuff's changed so much too, right? It's like instead of just, well, this is the rules. Why? Because I said so.
Wrong.
It's like when we, and it's the same thing in some, and I've worked in schools and I've met with teachers and we see this happen in the classroom space. And it's like, because that's what it is. We can't have that mentality when we have to be able to inform our young people, give them the why behind, give them the rationale. That's part of boosting their self-determination and providing them with a level of autonomy, competence and relatedness with us to continue to build connection in the classroom.
And sorry, can I just say? And
no, you can't. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
even when it's set, even when it's held, even when we provide a rationale, it's also okay if a young person doesn't like it.
100%.
That is so okay. Like I remember my mum was very strict on screen time when I was growing up. And that was when okay. We had one screen in the house, no, 2, TV and a computer, but like very strict on TV time and we were allowed, whatever it was. I loved Arthur. Anyway, I'm so a millennial. Whatever TV
Every
show.
day when you're walking down the street. Everybody that you meet.
I don't know the words.
Just very Gen Z of you.
Yes.
That's okay.
So we're allowed to watch that and then we had to turn it off and we had to go outside. And Mum gave us the rationale, like we need fresh air. You've been in a classroom all day. Like we need whatever it was. And I still didn't like it every single day. I didn't like it, but I'm very grateful for it. And I'm really grateful that she held it.
So 4 types of boundaries. What are they? Let's quickly whip through them. These are areas that we can talk to our students about in terms of boundaries that they can set, but also they're different types of boundaries we can reflect on and set for ourselves. And maybe we haven't thought about one of these areas and what our explicit boundaries are in different context areas of our life. So it's probably important to just do a quick little whiz through these.
So the first area is material boundaries. Now, this essentially refers to any material thing in our world. So it could be a device, right? Screen time and access to screen time.
I'm just thinking about, I have 2 younger sisters, and that this boundary just goes out the window when you have younger siblings.
100%.
I just had them at my house for for a week time, and I swear one of my sisters has gone home with half of my wardrobe and I don't even know about it. It's like material boundaries are such a real thing.
Yes, a real thing. And so that's what it might look like at home. At school, it might look like, okay, well, this is a shared resource, or these, pencils are shared, or we have, a shared book for the class, or shared dictionaries, or whatever it is. And their material, it's our laptops, it's our whatever it is, all of those things. These are our material resources and material boundaries, any boundaries we place on those items.
So one example of a boundary that I placed on Amanda during national tour was that Amanda wasn't allowed to touch our banners. Wasn't allowed to pull them down because, well, there's just been a few incidents.
Some people have some skill sets and other people have other skill sets. And when we play to our strengths, we work most effectively as a team.
There's a strong boundary put up.
We're like traveling around the country. And sometimes we would be at, places like the International Convention Centre, and I would go to touch a banner and I just hear these footsteps running and Will, don't touch the banner, stop Amanda. That is an example of a very hectic, unnecessary physical boundary.
Says the person with no boundaries around banners. So that's fine. I was going to say an example from like a primary school classroom that I've heard primary school teachers use to help with material boundaries is when they have shared classroom resources. So whether that's like a pencil sharpener or something that is like a shared resource, they name it and give it like a name. So they'll be like, this pencil sharpener's name is Frank. And so it becomes then more personal as well to the students, and they then have more respect and look after that item. So it's like kind of that initial of, I'm thinking, like from our preppies to our grade 1s and grade 2s, it's such a great way to help them build and learn respect for those material things we have. All of that stuff.
Absolutely. And also, like, if we don't have one-to-one devices, say there's a set of 10 iPads for a classroom, a material boundary around those might be, well, sure, you can use the iPad for 10 minutes, but the 10-minute time is held, and then when you return it, you have to leave it on charge so that it's ready for the next person. Like, that's a material boundary, and it teaches so much respect, and it teaches us to look after our things as well. And I really think if we don't have boundaries around our material things, it's challenging to build and have respect for the material things that we have.
Absolutely.
And without that respect, I think it's challenging to feel grateful for the things that we have.
And speaking of respect, it's kind of a great segue into our next boundary, and that boundary is physical boundaries. So our physical boundaries, these are all about our...
If you hear that, it's just my alarm going off because it's a reminder for me to eat.
Will has ADHD, for those that aren't aware, and if he doesn't set alarms to eat, he won't.
He also has a goal to gain weight. So here we are.
Don't worry,
Sorry, did I cross a boundary by sharing that on the podcast?
Accountability, okay?
That would be an emotional boundary, and we'll get to that soon. So a physical boundary is all about our physical space, right? This pertains to our physical selves and the space that we occupy. And I mean, one of my examples personally is that I'm not like a hugger as a person, which surprises people because I look so cuddly. But people, I meet people and automatically, particularly like we work in the youth space, we work a lot with educators and they're big feeling people. Often people will just straight away go in for the hug, and I 100% will cop it for that first interaction. But my boundary for me is then saying, hey, just so you know, I'm not so much of a hugger, and I turn it into like a bit of a joke and it becomes a thing, but it's also me enforcing that boundary for myself that I don't need to physically have your bodily fluid on me every time we see each other.
Okay, who are you hugging that is getting bodily fluid on you?
No, but you know what I mean? It's just for me, it's that thought anyway.
Yeah. Mine's escalators. It's like, can you just take a step back? We don't need to be this close.
Oh, interesting.
That's fair enough. Like if I can feel your breath on my cheek, you're too close to me.
That really surprises me because you have no issue. You jam elevators like no one I've ever seen. So escalators are a problem, but elevators you're willing to overpack.
Yeah.
Can
absolutely. Elevator games.
Oh, wow. So it's important in the classroom physical
Yes.
boundaries, because our students are all going to have different physical boundaries, and whether they understand them themselves, like to articulate them or not, is a whole other thing and will depend a lot on their age and stage. But being able to talk about that as an educator and say, hey, it's okay to respect one another's space, and some people like hugs, some people prefer a high five, and that's okay. And being able to really model that, it helps to set our students up for success when they are entering life outside of school, to just have that initial curiosity around others instead of just assuming that someone shares the same boundaries that you do.
And I think we can nurture the development of these physical boundaries through simple things like having it all be permission-based.
Yeah.
Like I'm personally a hugger, but I always ask, I'm like, are you a hugger? Do you want to have a hug? And that's just a little way of being permission-based.
Yeah.
And it allows the other person to check in with themselves and go, am I okay with that? Do I want Amanda's fluids on me? Because apparently that's what happens when people hug.
I know this is like a bit rogue, but I'm finding it, being a pregnant person, having people just like randomly touch my stomach.
Oh,
that's
huge.
very-
Which is like at the dog park the other day, this lady came up and like I've never even seen this person at the dog park before. And she just like straight away just reached out and like
Really?
rubbed my belly. And I was like, would you like to make a wish? Like what is going on here? But that for me was like, I was straight away, I kind of took a step back and she read it straight away as being
good.
like, but that's also a skill, right? When we can physically read one another's boundaries in that way. But young people might not have the ability to recognize that the way that we do as regulated adults. So it's something as well that we can really enforce in those educative spaces.
So we have material boundaries, physical boundaries. What's our third?
Third one is mental boundaries. And this is often one that is typically tested around the holiday season when families across generation come together.
Say it again, loud for everyone in the back.
The amount of political conversations I've had around the Christmas dinner table over the years has been quite a lot that I didn't actually. I spent Christmas alone this year.
You actually did.
I did. Not for that reason, but mental boundaries are then boundaries that we put on our own beliefs and our values and holding them very firm. And they are often challenged when someone is trying to give you their belief or their thought, and you don't know, or you aren't confident enough in yourself to be able to hold that and be like, well, this is what I believe. I know that you'll believe that. That's okay, but this is mine.
And it's not about like flip-flopping, right? It's not to say that we can be fluid in our thought processes and how we interact with others. So if someone suggests or shares a new opinion with us and it's maybe a perspective we haven't
be like a
considered
boom.
before, it's not like, well, that's not what I believe.
No.
But it's being like firm enough in what we do believe and our thought processes and our opinions to be able to go, oh, that's really interesting. And I can be curious about it, but still hold and stay true to myself.
And we should be
within-
curious to it, right?
Yes,
we need to be
absolutely.
having different conversations with perspectives.
But it's not hearing a belief or a new opinion or whatever it might be and being like, great, where do I sign up to this theory? Because that's not having that certainty or having clear boundaries with ourselves. And sometimes that can happen when we are like, for our more vulnerable members of society, it's that lack of mental boundaries or understanding how they work that can really lead down some dark holes sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's a really important boundary to be aware of.
And also backing yourself too, like how much you already know. It's like just because someone maybe perceives themselves as more intelligent doesn't mean they are.
Yes, and even if they're well-intentioned and they think that their way is right, it's like nothing is more right than what you believe for yourself and for your world.
One of my favorite kind of go-to lines, because I actively try and put myself into spaces where people think differently to the way that I do, as I know that both of you do as well. And if someone presents something that I'm like unsure of, rather than just like agreeing or going along for the sake of the conversation or for whatever it might be to save social face, I just will have a throwaway line that's something like, oh, that's really interesting. I'd love to learn more about that. Or I'll have to go away and think about that and come back to you with my thoughts. Like we don't have to in the moment respond, you know?
And I think working with young people, it's just about making it super accessible that it's okay to have different opinions. We do not all have to believe the exact same thing all the time.
Probably
It is
be a little
okay.
bit problematic, wouldn't it?
Well, it would be so, and imagine how boring it would be as well. It's like we don't have to be all the same, but it's also not this huge dichotomy of like it's black or white, or it's like, pink or blue or whatever it is. It's like we access our beliefs and our thoughts from a place that is right for us, and that's
Yeah.
okay.
That is mental boundaries. The last one is
Emotional boundaries. This refers to, wow, I don't know why I sung that, but I
was
really
beautiful.
enjoyed
That's
it.
fine. I was
Thank
going to say
you.
yeehaw at the end.
This refers to an individual's emotions and allowing an individual's emotions to be right where they are, like not making them wrong, letting them be okay, but it also relates to us knowing ourselves well enough to know what we need to regulate our own emotions. So when we don't have boundaries in place, when we don't have emotional boundaries in place, what can happen is we can become very dysregulated, and what tends to happen when that occurs is we tend to push that dysregulation onto other people. It's our responsibility as adults, as role models in the lives of young people, to know what we need, to know our emotional boundaries. And if we need to take some space, or if we need to prepare ourselves so that we can handle the day, then we need to do that. And that's a responsibility that we have. And, you know, this is where it's like we all have those button pushes in our lives, and sometimes those button pushes will overstep our mental boundaries. But so often that is like a cascading effect into our emotional boundaries. And it's like mentally we're frustrated. We're like, can't we just open our thinking here? But then immediately it's like our emotions, we get even more frustrated, and it can kind of it cascades, and we can lose ourselves in those moments unless we know what we need.
And I'm thinking of an example. I had a student come to me a couple of years ago, and they expressed that they were feeling as though they didn't really know their place in their friendship group. And I came from a place of curiosity, and I was like, that's really interesting that you've raised this. Could you tell me more about, like, why are you feeling this way? I just got curious. And the student said, well, at lunchtime when like we sit down, we have recess and we have lunch, all my group of friends want to do is like bitch and talk about other people. And it's like there was this real like gossip culture that this student had identified. And it was really interesting because straight away I was like, well, that's an emotional boundary that they've set in place, that they don't need to invest in those kind of conversations. That for them was an overstep of their boundary. And so as an educator at that moment, I was like, that's really cool. You've actually just identified a boundary for yourself in terms of that. And it's helping you to know who your people are. So you're then growing as a person as well. And she was like, oh, that's really interesting. So instead of it being this thing of like, I don't fit in anymore, I don't fit in, it's more like I'm learning who I am as a person, what my boundaries are. And through acknowledging and respecting my boundaries, I will find my people as well. And we can do that as educators. So it's cool to label it and call it out when we see them happening as well.
Absolutely.
I think this has been such a good flow on from our last episode of the year last year, which was Circle of Control. And knowing that our boundaries are well within our circle of control.
Yeah, they are. And if we find ourselves feeling tension or feeling frustration or feeling resentment, that is an absolute signal that we need to get clear with our boundaries and implement them in places in our world, because that especially resentment and that tension with another person or with a situation is a sign that we need a boundary in place.
And I think important to note, it's okay to go back on things as well. So like similar to you, Amanda, and I know that you're the exact same, Will, and we're all learning in this space as yes people. When we get asked to do something perhaps and straight away we're like, yeah, of course. And then we walk away from that conversation or phone call or email or whatever it is. And we're like, oh, hang on a second. Do I actually want to do that? Or I can feel straight away that I've got some like resentment or anxiety or something already bubbling to the surface. It's okay for me to go away and say, hey, on second thought, I've just had to think about it and I don't actually have the space right now to do X, Y, Z or whatever it is. And it's the same thing. Teachers get asked to go above and beyond their scope of work all the time.
And what happens is the better you are at your job and the more efficient you are at your job, you get the prize of getting more work.
It's like that age-old thing of if you want something done, ask the busiest person you know to do it because they'll get it done. And it's like we don't have to live that way. That can be a boundary we have in place. So asking for what we need in that way, but also being able to go back on, you know, because it's not like going back. It's just saying you can do it in a really respectful way. Hey, I don't actually have capacity for that right now.
I know.
Check in next month or whatever it might be.
I know last year I organised the whole sports carnival, and that was already on top of my other 12 extracurricular commitments in the school landscape, in addition to being having a full teaching load. And this year it's just not something I can do. I just didn't cope well with it. And
maybe just start saying, if someone asks you to do something that's outside of your scope of work, be like, I'm more than happy to discuss what my pay would be for that additional responsibility. Could you imagine?
My
so good.
So permission to say no, permission to get clear.
Build your boundaries.
Yeah, build your boundaries, and also emphasis on it could be a little challenging, especially kicking off a classroom year and implementing and holding boundaries, but it's worth it. And our young people's role is not to see a boundary and be like, oh, okay, I will just stand right next to it.
No,
is
think
their role
about
to
it.
push up against it?
Yes, and think about our boundary setting as like the three little pigs, right? If someone's going to huff and puff and try and blow those boundaries down, we want to make sure that we are building those boundaries as strong as we can.
We are PodClass. It's been wonderful to be with you all, and we'll see you next week.
See you
Yeehaw.
next week.
Bye.
Bye.
I'll be here for you, 'cause you're there for them too.
Thanks so much for tuning into PodClass. If you've enjoyed this episode, we would adore it if you could go on to Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. 5 stars would be lovely. We would love to get this podcast into as many ears as possible so we can help and support as many people as possible who help young people. And if you're not already doing so, please go along to Instagram and follow us at podclass.aus.